The funny thing about complexity is you have to be so careful when you're writing about it or you're even reading about it that you don't get into the magic land, right? Like complexity science is so complicated. So if you were going to describe for people what is the study of complexity, what does that actually mean?
It's the emergence of complexity from simplicity. So the best example is life. Let's say us. At the bottom, we're a bunch of atoms jiggling around. Atoms are actually quite simple. Every hydrogen atom is identical to every other hydrogen atom. Take away the isotopes of deuterium and tritium, but plain old hydrogen, everyone's identical. Every electron is identical to every other electron. So this is actually a very simple domain. But then, these atoms get together and produce molecules. It gets more complicated. And the molecules get together and produce bigger molecules, organic chemistry, which is hugely complicated. And then that turns into eventually cells, which have metabolisms, which, the graph of the metabolism of the simplest bacteria, I've actually seen this on the wall, a friend of mine's office, cover 8 feet of whiteboard in, the average circle about this big. And so metabolism is an emergent, it emerges from biochemistry. Then you have a single cell entity, and then magically, we don't know how, but about 500 million years ago, the single cells started operating together as multicellular entities, and the so-called Cambrian explosion. And then they started evolving, and from that one event, we believe it was that one single event, essentially all the animal life in the world evolved relatively rapidly, and so basically you have animals which start to be created from cells, which become tissues, which become organs, which become systems. Like think of the circulatory system that Jeffrey West probably talked to you about, and then it adds up to an organism like us. And an organism lives in an ecosystem, which emerges from the interaction of all the participants, both humans and other animals as well. So that's one of the very best examples of complexity from simplicity. The other one I like to use, is cuts right to the quick, is I like to talk about the relationship between the dancer and the dance. One can think of the dancers as sort of interchangeable elements, but the dance is the emergent interaction of all the dancers under the influence of the music. So you can think of a dance as a complex emergent phenomena that is the dancers in motion under the influence of the field of a piece of music. So long answer to a short question. Hope that helps.
This is excellent. I find the Santa Fe Institute's research and the discoveries that they make to be profound, and actually to have many, many applications to my own life, if not only just the prism through which I see things. The one that I think is probably the most common example that people here talked about is that you can track how fast people are walking, and then backwards calculate based on how fast they're walking, how dense the city is within 10,000 people. And that to me is shocking, because it doesn't matter what continent they're on. It doesn't matter what latitude they're at. Really, the speed that people are walking at is based on how closely are you packed in there. And you think about that and you say, okay, let's assume this is true. Let's say the research is correct. What other things are going on in the minds of individuals that are impacted just by the virtue of how many other people they're surrounded by? Not even other people that they're talking to, just how many people they're surrounded by.
If you remember talking to Jeffrey West, turns out there's a whole bunch, right? Turns out things like the number of patents per capita, the amount of crime per capita, so good things and bad things, the amount of HIV per capita, all rise at about the same exponent, 1.15, which is very interesting. While at the same time, the infrastructure it is sublinear. So there's less gas stations per capita, less miles of natural gas lines, less grocery stores per capita, the more densely people are tied together. So at the infrastructure side, just like in the human body, you get sublinear scaling. You don't need as much. A mouse is much more dense in terms of its infrastructure than an elephant is, or a human. A really big city actually has less infrastructure per capita than a small town, oddly enough. It just has a lot more of it. But the outputs are super linear, both the good ones and the bad. How fast you walk, number of patents, the amount of your earnings per capita, amount of education, almost any metric you can talk about. But then the bad stuff too, crime and disease are also super linear. You get more crime and disease per capita in the bigger cities.
I think that when I started to first realize what was going on with complexity in the Santa Fe Institute, I think that was one of my first steps back from the edge of nihilism, right? Where you think, well, nothing really means anything. Everything's so big. Where do you fit in the billion-year, system of the universe? But then you start seeing something like complexity and you see, at least I have a sense of awe. And I think about you describing that you're building games or neural networks that can learn, which almost puts you in the position, I don't want to overstate it, but as a god, right? You are able to create something that can create something else and spin off. Do you have this same sense of awe? Do you have this feeling of power because you can create something that can evolve on its own?
Yeah, as it said in that New York Times article back in 2001, when I first saw it actually work, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was like, shit, I just wrote some simple rules and told them to go do their thing, and they got smarter on their own. Wow. And of course, now people take that to a crazy degree. Famously, DeepMinds at Google has created this whole family of learning algorithms called AlphaZero, which it has no knowledge at all of a game. You just tell it the rules and it starts playing it with itself, and it becomes a world champion in like 2 days. AlphaZero is now the world champ in chess and Go and several other games. And that's with no knowledge of the game other than playing itself. It's amazing. And yeah, it's truly amazing. And the bigger lens of complexity, of course, it leads us to believe that's how everything got here, that same way, playing with itself in evolutionary competition. And it takes the statement that nothing in biology makes sense except through the lens of evolution. One of the famous, I don't remember who, one of the famous biologists said that. You can now say the history of the universe makes no sense other than through the lens of evolution. And that is a really powerful lens.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.